Thank you, Shirin, for the introduction. First, I would like to thank the GEFI who are inviting me to the Ethical Finance ASEAN 2022, co-hosting with AICV. With me today, we have the three esteemed panel speakers, which I will introduce all of them. First panel speaker is Mr. Shahril Azuar Jimin. He was appointed as MayBank first sustainable officer on 1st March 2021. He led MayBank group effort on sustainability with focusing on environmental, social, and governance. So we have the second panel for this conference, which are very famous in ASEAN and also in the world, which is Tan Sri Azman Mokhtar. Welcome, Tan Sri. Tan Sri Azman Mokhtar is currently the chairman of Lembaga Tabung Haji, Malaysia, Hajj Pilgrim Fund Board, the chairman of Board of Director of University Technology Malaysia, or UTM, and the chairman of INSAFE, the International Center for Education in Islamic Finance in Malaysia. Between June 2004 and July 2018, he was the managing director of Khazanah Nasional Berhad, or Khazanah, Malaysia Strategic Investment Fund. So our third panel for this conference is Mrs. Komi Rajdev. Yeah, as a head business development, ASEAN in Moody ESG solution, Komi is responsible for client in the region for sustainable finance, ESG, and climate data. She has over 20 years of experience in international banking and credit rating in the region. So to start with, I think this panel session will look at the social issue, which is the S in SG from regional perspective. What is social finance? In actual fact, is a finance that is some considered social issue. That could mean addressing poverty, respecting labor rights. It could mean not engaging in sin sectors. It could mean trying to avoid causing harm and division in the way that many social media companies have been accused of. So now we come to my first question to our first panel, Mr. Shahril here, which is how much of a concern of social issue such as poverty and financial inclusion in the approach to sustainable finance in Asia?
Thank you, Dato. Thank you, Dato. Zabidi. I'd be more than happy to give the honor to Tan Sri Azman first, but since you asked me, well, say when we talk about sustainability issues or leading towards sustainable finance and so on, I would like to paraphrase first what is therefore the sustainability challenge actually that we're looking at. So I would say that the sustainability challenge, or at least how we look at it in MayBank, is the pursuit of economic progress whilst doing well in the areas of environmental, social, and governance. So it's one of the things that we really need to address if we were to look at sustainability and the pursuit of economic progress as part of the larger sustainability challenge. So yes, when we look at it from the capital markets and financial institution perspective, we look at it from the lens of ESG. So the social pillar is a huge imperative. So how much of the concerns of social issues such as poverty and financial inclusion, as you say, I would like to look at it from the precursors to financial inclusion. I would like to look at financial literacy, and I would like to look at financial access before we even look at financial inclusion and how we can attempt to elevate or eradicate poverty. So financial literacy, we like to say, is a precursor to financial inclusion. And by raising financial literacy, we will be able to empower individuals with the knowledge and skills necessary to make responsible financial decisions and improve their financial well-being. It's easier said than done. You'll be surprised at the levels of financial literacy within the ASEAN region, which is quite low actually. So a recent World Bank survey on the financial literacy of adults indicated that the financial literacy lags behind in many ASEAN countries, with Philippines at only 25%, compared to 59% in Singapore, 52% in Myanmar, and 36% in Malaysia, among others. And this is something that we really need to address in terms of financial literacy. And then we go on to the issue of financial access. And this is where, as a bank, we have a large role to play. And I'm often asked, what would you do as a bank in this regard? So we are cognizant of the fact that as a bank, we have the power to move capital in the right direction, away from harm to social and environmental degradation towards social development. So access to financial services, therefore, is important in every household. Provision of financial services such as savings, payments, and even credit that can make a substantial positive difference to lives. Again, we often take it lightly. We talk about access to financial services, but we talk about the ASEAN region. I'll give you an example. In the Philippines, 70% of the adult population is unbanked. So 70% of the Philippine population is unbanked, and that's a huge number, which provides a huge opportunity for organizations like MayBank to make a difference. Again, in the Philippines, there's 1,600 municipalities, and 610 of them are without any banking office. So there's a large role that we need to play, that we need to address before we even talk about the issue of financial inclusion. We need to address financial literacy. We need to address financial access. So that's how I would start this discussion, at least from a viewpoint of a bank.
Thank you, Mr. Shahril. Since that the Asian countries still, in terms of the financial services, still low, right? And also we can see in terms of financial services that you mentioned just now is about 70%, unbanked, like in the Philippines. Continuous from this, from your answer, I want to go to Tan Sri Azman to get some question that I wanted to ask Tan Sri over here, Tan Sri. To what extent religious values are important part of social finance? To you, Tan Sri
Azman. Yeah, thank you, Dato Sri, moderator, fellow panelists, Shahril and Komi, and thank you to GEFI for the invitation. I suppose the issue of values, religious values, as what was posed within the topic of the S in ESG, I think it's appropriate that we are on a panel about ASEAN, convened by GEFI. I'm not sure, is it GEFI or GEFI? GEFI, the Global Ethical Finance Initiative. I happen to be on the steering board of GEFI, and you may know that the Ethical Finance Initiative, if I were to relate that to religious values as you post, started and still is based in Scotland. In fact, it's based in Edinburgh, which is of course the home of Adam Smith, as we know, who is the, I suppose, well, apart from being the author of The Wealth of Nations, he also wrote something called the Theory of Moral Sentiments, as you know. In fact, he wrote the Theory of Moral Sentiment first, and then The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations became a bestseller. He went back and rewrote the Theory of Moral Sentiment. Why is this relevant? Is Adam Smith grew out of the so-called Scottish Enlightenment, which in itself was out of the European Enlightenment. So this one, we have to track back to how this thing evolved, finance. in the context of the religious framework of a Europe that was changing. So the so-called Descartes, I know that I don't intend to get the thing. Descartes, etc., etc. Now, the relevance of this, of course, values are relevant, whether religious or ethical or morality, as you put it. The reason being, no amount of governance systems, ESG standards, taxonomies, rating agencies, investors that we can put that you can fully govern the actions and the outcome, in any process, including the investment and the financing process. That's my first point. So therefore, some have said, you have corporate governance, national governance, there's something called human governance, I suppose. So to relate an anecdote, I believe GEFI and Chris and Christine from GEFI can confirm this. We declared something called the Edinburgh Declaration. If you go into the GEFI website, which I believe was joint work between the UK Islamic Finance Council, the Church of Scotland and the Church of England. So the various faith communities addressing finance punya principles, somewhat even before the whole ESG, SDG movement. So this was relatively early. So the likes of Dr. Rowan Williams, for example, was the Archbishop of Canterbury, participated in this. Along the way, we found that quite large chunks of the UK public actually basically profess to be of non-faith punya affiliation. And therefore, the language of this declaration was also, what do you call it, it accommodated non-faith into ethical and moral frameworks. I like to think, in a nutshell, therefore, the second point is there are a lot of common positive things from the various religions, both the Abrahamic faith as well as the Dharmic faith, which include Buddhism, etc., as well as the so-called non-faith, basically values and from values and ethics. So I would say it plays actually the underlying philosophical base to have any meaningful discussion on ESG, whether the S in ESG or ESG itself. Because one of the major challenges of the ESG movement, good as it is the issue of greenwashing. To really overcome greenwashing, you really need to go back to some very basic first principles. And finally, some of our discussions so far on this, we said we must go back to the real Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations in the context of the moral economy. But actually, the faith community will tell you, you've got to go back not just to Adam Smith, but to Adam himself. Because Adam is the first human being and the first prophet. For us Muslims, we believe, of course, the last prophet is our Prophet Mohamad, and all the faiths in between. So slightly long, but I hope that helps to contextualize.
Thank you. Thanks, Azman. I think I agree with you in terms of the all religions. They have value, good value. Consider the important part of the social finance, which is, I think, in any religious, you mentioned that all religions, whether Christian or Muslim, Islam, that kind of thing, there must be a good things that can, create a value to make sure the real social finance is established and also having practices. So in terms of all this important of all this issue to address, right? Now I came to Komi on one question that, how able are investors to use rating and data to make decisions based on social factors? To you, Komi.
Thank you, Dr. Mohamad. Thank you for your introduction of myself as well earlier. And I want to say that I'm really delighted to be part of this inaugural ASEAN Ethical Finance event, as well as I feel privileged to be part of a panelist with Mr. Shahril and Tan Sri Azman, very esteemed panelists along with me. So with that, thank you for that question. I think it's very interesting to actually get started back again on a little bit of a definition on the S here. So S in terms of social factors, mainly why it's interesting to the investors is that it poses a risk to the company's financial performance. So some of the issues that can come up with the social part are labor standards, for example, human rights, racial justice, that Tan Sri Azman mentioned earlier as well, or supply chain issues. And the more major mega trends today, like automation and innovative, and also disruptions, as well as AI, artificial intelligence, all of these are also the mega trends today for the social part. I just want to also share from the lens of ESG, customers are increasingly coming towards us for a holistic view for associated risk and opportunities that are also related to the S social part. Then it is very important to also discuss about the relevance of the ESG ratings and data for investors. So mainly there are like four main types of investors. Investors that are looking for a quick risk flags, for example, red flags in their investment portfolio in terms of S or E and G. And there's another group of investors who are passive investors who may use the data to screen or weigh portfolios to, for example, include, exclude, overweight or underweight sectors and stocks. Then next, we have the sustainable investment novice. These are the active space who may use data and ratings to adjust weightings in their portfolios and do an ESG integration box. And the next type of investors are the shallow approach engagement-oriented investors who use companies' disclosures and ESG ratings more like a proxy for management commitment. Yeah. These are mainly the type of investors that we are looking at. And then the next one will be on the we're looking at the relevance, for example, of the ESG ratings and data. In this case, we are looking at two types. For example, top-down screening of portfolios or creating indexes. And also, more specifically, on company peer analysis. So I can give you an example, for example, carbon footprint for the top-down screening portfolios, and also, for example, to create a low carbon index. These are the kind of things that the investors will look at. Other factors are like, for example, when they are looking at relative sugar content, for example, in soft drinks for the corporates, they want to use this as a social shift to healthy foods, for example. So overall, for asset managers, generally disclosure of policy-based engagement is really, really important. And that's the main factors for using ESG data and ESG ratings. There are also, it's important for us to talk about the challenges that come up because of enabling the investors. So similar concept to the E pillar, S also has common challenges. For example, definition of the S, standards, measurement approaches that the industry is still maturing around. And also it's a little bit more difficult to quantify the social impact, and that remains a challenge. With that, I just want to highlight 2021 ESG survey by BNP Paribas, which revealed that 51% of the investors found the S to be the most difficult to analyze and embed into their investment strategies. In that findings also, that data acutely lacked in terms of standardization around social metrics. So this is one of the reasons why accepting data and assessing social performance by companies they invest can become difficult. The other factors are also for investors, S becomes merely a checkbox exercise, while the growing demand and the risk expectations from market participants and investors for transparency, the decision useful ESG and social data becomes important. I'll just move on a little bit more towards other challenges as well. And I would like to also share with you that BlackRock had a proxy voting guideline that for the US companies to disclose workforce demographics, such as race, ethnicity, gender, in line with the US equal opportunity employment. These are some of the changes and challenges that can be addressed. And it's also noted that for human capital management, critical factors in fostering an inclusive, diverse, and engaged workforce contributes to business continuity and innovation for long-term value creation. So the pressure is really coming from the investors. For example, the UK's largest investment companies, Legal and General, has warned it will vote against any FTSE 100 company that still has an all-white board by 2022. That's this year, right? So pushing for ESG disclosure is gaining momentum. And the likelihood the rulemaking by SEC will be in connection with the human capital disclosure will also increase. So with that, similarly, FCA is pushing for diversity disclosure by all listed companies and has proposed a mandated level of diversity on listed company boards for women and ethnic minorities in UK. So the work is going on, and essentially more pressure will be put on disclosing. With that, I just want to say that generally complex assessment, coverage of broad topics are all difficult parts for the social. It's a little different for the governance and environment in this case, basically because there is no consistent regulatory standards. Unlike, for example, environment, there is a net zero agreement, and there is also many companies are also lacking uniform reporting framework. And for social opportunities, for example, Moody's has the Moody's Sustainable Goods and Services provides services in in-depth assessment, proportion of commercial activities that links to the United Nations. So these are kind of the things that we are able to support for Moody's from our perspective. And with that, I would also like to hand over the floor back to Dato Sri, Dr. Mohamad, and hope to be taking care together with the rest of my panelists in the fireside discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for your very detailed in terms of the importance of the data for the ESG, because if we can see the current investor are looking towards the data, because when they wanted to invest, they must have something like, to make sure the decision they are making based on certain, very accurate data. So this is very important. But you mentioned about the challenges also. I think that part, during the current trend, I can see that it has been pushing towards to make sure that the sustainability agenda in terms of the data will be available for investors to invest in any company, especially the big company, because for them, for the company itself, it's a pleasure for them, because new investors are looking, believe that this company that implement ESG, then the profitability of the company will be increased further and further. Thanks, Komi, for your detailed explanation on the data itself. So now we go to round two now. We go back to Mr. Shahril on the question for you, Shahril. Would you say the social issue are more or less important than climate to people in Asia? How does this differ between finance professional and the general public? To you, Shahril.
Thank you, Dato Sri. It's a bit difficult to answer that, because in many ways they are also interrelated. Many of the impact of climate change and social issues are interrelated. It is said that we live in a world of 3 C's today: conflict, COVID, and climate change. It is said that we live in the world of 3 C's. I like to say that there is a 4th C: complicity. If we don't do anything, then we are complicit to the issues of conflict, climate change, and COVID. So minimal 3C, I say 4C lah. But so if you ask which issues are more important between social or climate in ASEAN, I would like to give you some evidence to my answer on that. So there is a very recent survey report conducted by ASEAN through the ASEAN Secretariat, and it's called the 2021 Survey Report on the State of Southeast Asia. And they looked at the top 10 challenges facing people in ASEAN. And this was a huge survey undertaken by ASEAN amongst ordinary people throughout all the 10 ASEAN member states. So the top concern among the peoples of ASEAN is, number one, the threat to health from COVID-19 pandemic. That's the biggest concern. And it differs country to country. The strongest anxiety is felt in Laos at 90%. Second is Myanmar at 87%. And third is Indonesia at 84%. Whilst the lower ones are Singapore at 63%, Thailand at 64%, and Brunei at 69%, which I guess reflect the health infrastructure and capabilities of those countries. So the first concern is threat from COVID-19 pandemic. The second concern from the survey that they found was actually economic recession and the issue of unemployment. And that was a big factor among all the ASEAN peoples that were surveyed. The third biggest concern is the widening socio-economic gaps and rising income disparity. And this is a big thing because within ASEAN, the gap between the richest and the poorest is 40 times. So that's a big concern. Now, climate change came in at number 4. So if you ask me, which is more important within this region, I'll give you the survey results. So climate change is ranked as number 4. Health and social issues are the top 3 things on the minds of peoples within this region. And with good reason. So in the Asia Pacific region alone, more than 820 million workers in the informal economy and over 70 million children in low-income households have been hit hard by COVID's economic impacts. And in last year, 2021 alone, if I recall, an additional 85 million people were pushed into extreme poverty. So that's huge. And I think that is on people's mind more than the impacts of climate change, although there is direct correlation, although not immediate. We all know the potential effects of climate change. If we do not do anything today, the world will experience an average increase in global temperatures by 3.4 degrees by the year 2100. I think everybody knows that, and hence all the net zero actions that has been put in place. So trying to keep the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees and so on. But that sometimes seems far away from the thoughts of the people here in terms of the issues of climate and what needs to be done, knowing very well that carbon in the atmosphere today were not emitted in recent times, but go back as far as the Industrial Revolution. So the impact of which has brought about economic growth to developed countries at the expense of the environment. And we in ASEAN are at different stages of progress, and especially in relation to climate policies. We're paying the price for economic development in the more advanced countries. So for me, if you ask me which is more important, definitely I would place a lot of emphasis on the social issues, but we need to address the issue of climate change because it will exacerbate the social problems. Rising temperatures will lead to rising waters, floods, putting cities like Jakarta, Bangkok underwater throughout the region. So what we at MayBank are doing to make sure that in terms of preparing for sustainable finance and so on, we need to ensure a fair and just transition. So we need to strike a balance between environment and social imperatives as we're facing different challenges from those in the developed world. So we should be given the opportunity to progress we should be given the opportunity to enable social development whilst addressing the climate issues in the world today. Thank you, Dato Sri.
Thanks, Mr. Shahril. In actual fact, I agree with you because we can see from the data that you've given, right? Since that the climate change is number 4 concerned by the Asian country, I think, but in Malaysia, I think we are moving towards to make sure the climate change is one of the agenda of some of the financial institutions, whereby we wanted to lending to make sure that all these, the company that wanted to doing their business or expand their business, not should consider in terms of the protecting the environment, which is will save the agenda of the climate change there. Moving forward, then you are a banker. There is another question that I wanted to ask you. How are banks in Malaysia and throughout the region tackling financial inclusion? And what impact has the pandemic had on financial inclusion? To you, Mr. Shahril.
Okay. Getting your money's worth. Okay.
I agree.
A lot of things in Malaysia, at least for banking, which is a highly regulated industry, are driven by the regulators, as you know. Even the issue of climate change, before we talk about financial inclusion, Securities Commission, Bank Negara Malaysia, Bursa Malaysia have all come up with various guidelines, various exposure drafts. There's a joint committee on climate change co-chaired by Bank Negara and Securities Commission. So it's all being addressed. We have the climate change and principle-based taxonomy being put in place right now. So whilst those are new, we are addressing that. But the issue of financial inclusion, at least in Malaysia, you're asking me about the banks in Malaysia, it's been there a while. It's just that with technology, banks need to pivot, need to change the approach. So the biggest thing that we're doing, at least in MayBank, in terms of tackling financial inclusion, and this is a huge global opportunity, is going digital and the issue of digital finance. And even at the G20, this has been reaffirmed, following its commitment to implement the G20 high-level principles of digital financial inclusion. So we've already put this in our new MayBank corporate strategy called M25, which is our strategy from 2020 to 2025, in which one of the 3 key pillars is being pervasively digital. And this means enhancing financial access and inclusion, and also addressing the S in ESG at the same time. And we see this as a big enabler, particularly in countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, big countries across its thousands of islands. We see that going digital does provide better access to financial services, given that there are not many physical banks in many of the 7,700 islands across the Philippines and so on. But in Malaysia itself, one of the things that we do in terms of financial inclusion, and when we talk about financial inclusion, it's not just about ordinary people on the street. We're talking about financial inclusion for SMEs as well. We don't forget. So one of the things that has been quite successful in Malaysia is our SME digital financing. So we've come up with an end-to-end solution for SMEs, providing straight-through processing from application, approval, up to disbursement. We offer quick, hassle-free financing solutions at the convenience. We launched this in September 2020, and we've already disbursed financing to 11,000 micro enterprises, totaling about 1.3 billion ringgit. So that's for SME. Make it easy, provide easy access for them. We've also have a specialized program called SME Business Financing. We come up with a MayBank to You business app, also to provide secure mobile banking services to assist SMEs in their day-to-day operations. And since the launch in October 2021, we have more than 18,000 companies, SMEs, signing up, generating more than 110,000 transactions, coming up to nearly 500 million ringgit. We've another measure of our pivot to digital is that we support local businesses, small stallholders, particularly food vendors and so on, by coming up with a program called Sama Sama Local. It's a zero commission online marketplace to help empower these merchants stay afloat, especially in the last 2 years during the COVID pandemic, by providing them opportunity to digitize their businesses and to gain greater access to customers. So it is big. Digital is something that we're going big on, but at the same time, we also do various social impact investments on the ground to empower our people, and this is done primarily through our MayBank Foundation, which runs programs in all the 10 ASEAN countries. Programs like empowering and giving mentoring to disabled people, PWDs. For economic empowerment and financial inclusion. We've trained more than 13,000 disabled people to become successful business people across 4 or 5 countries throughout ASEAN. We also have a program called MayBank Women Eco Weavers. We build centers for capacity building in weaving. We have 8 of them in countries across ASEAN, Laos, Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, for example, to ensure that people still are able to generate income, but at the same time, in this program called MayBank Women Eco Weavers, continue and maintain the culture and heritage. Various things that we're doing, from going digital to social impact investments on the ground itself.
Yeah. Thanks, Mr. Shahril. I think it's good whereby MayBank have been done this initiative. I think based on the Malaysian financial institution, other banks also starting doing this, because SMEs sector is very big. Is part of the supporting the Malaysian economy itself. So well done to MayBank that you're going towards digital, then hopefully other financial institutions, especially in Malaysia, will follow through. So now we go towards to the Tan Sri Azman on the question that does all Islamic finance have a responsibility to address social issues such as addiction, immorality, etc., that are prohibited for Islamic finance, or should this be the primary focus for Islamic institution? Over to you, Tan Sri Azman.
Yeah, how much time do we have left? I'm afraid MayBank has crowded us out, Shahril.
Okay.
There was a sign that says 5 minutes left. That was 1 minute ago.
Okay.
So I'm mindful Komi needs some time too. So,
okay.
So I'm just gonna to say that I think between the trade-off between people and planet, I think it's a bit of a false binary. Both are important, and Shahril made the point they're both interrelated. Jadi the people side actually is more difficult to measure. I think for me, you quoted the Paribas punya study, which is very relevant. It's difficult to measure, difficult to define. But the bottom line to me is as follows. What are we really talking about when we talk about S? Especially in the context of ASEAN, number one is about labor rights. The issue of modern slavery, for example, is very topical. Whether it's Top Glove, whether it's plantation companies, and so on. The second is about worker and staff rights and worker and staff development, which may include or will include DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion issues, whether gender, whether race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc. Of course, these are culturally bound issues, so we need to take that in mind. And thirdly, then, it's about society itself. We talk about poverty, human rights, addiction, etc. So I would like to end on my side to say that perhaps what is useful to me is the call to action, because to measure to this, the taxonomy, the alphabet soup is a long story. So I would like to highlight four quick principles. Number one, before we do good, do no harm first. So we should look and see, for example, if there are bad labor practices, remove that, whether migrant labor or local labor or harassment and things like that. or exploitation of delivery, of workers. Secondly, do good begins at home. So think about workers' development. Just like charity needs to begin at home. What are we doing about our own staff, etc. Number three, this is the external situation. I think there are limits. If the question is about finance punya role in society, finance and business is important, but that it's not everything. You cannot solve everything. We can't and shouldn't be expected, even if we operate in a stakeholder economy. There are limits. What is that limit? That's a long question about the role of business, Milton Friedman, etc. But we know and we subscribe the ESG movement is something that society needs to deliver. And finally, I would say, at the end of the day, we go back and ask whether religious or ethical values. I would like to pose the question, one way to overcome greenwashing is to ask, how green is your love? Are we really serious that no matter how much standards and measurement and rating that we do, you and I know, at the end of the day, it's personal agency and institutional agency to see whether we are serious. We know, don't do harm and then do good. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tan Sri. A very brief one. Building from the your comment on the religious value, my next question is, how does the process of incorporating religious value work in diverse, pluralistic society? What can be done to bring people together in this case? Yeah.
You're asking me. I don't have anything more to say already. Sorry, I summarize.
Okay.
Okay.
So thank you, Tan Sri. So now we go to the Komi. Yeah. Is it often hard to quantify social issue? How have Moody's and other overcome these challenges? Over to you, Komi.
Thank you for that question. So yes, definitely, as we earlier find out, as well as I spoke to you, that quantifying S is difficult and a big challenge. I would like to look at it from two different buckets. One from the disclosure and social taxonomy, empowering investors to better assess social risk to avoid the social washing. And earlier, Tan Sri Azman mentioned repeatedly again, DNSH, right? Do no significant harm. So those kind of taxonomies should include all of those, and it will be critical to categorize such activities, whichever is socially harmful. Just totally remove that first, right? That's the high priority and almost mandatory to do that. The second way, from the taxonomy disclosure perspective, the way to quantify and empower investors will be to look at corporate sustainability reporting directives to include social issues. We also recently saw that Climate Disclosure Standards Board merged with the ISSB to fill the gap in social disclosures. So this is one bucket, disclosures and social taxonomy. Another one is from the investor practices itself. What should investors do? Disclosure and reporting, performances on social topics. So for example, positive or negative screening, engagement in voting, including labor issues, diversity, inclusion, such kind of data criteria, health and safety issues. Then again, for customer-related issues, product safety, fair marketing. And one more other step I would like to take from the investor perspective is that social and sustainability bonds and sustainability linked bonds today are really important to achieve the social targets that are set. And for this, leading standards like ICMA, principles of social principles and sustainability principles are guidelines to follow for investors. That's one of the key criteria that I would say that is useful to look at to avoid this social washing. And other things that Moody's has done, for example, we have services like Moody's ESG scores that takes into account all aspects of ESG. Social is one of them. In our categories, we are using actually international standards, reference text, UN, OECD, ILO, for example. And we're looking at this from 40 different sectors, the specific, and we look at 30 distinct ESG criteria. Out of that 38 criteria that we look at, half of them are actually social considerations and social focus. So this really helps companies to become socially focused and using socially focused metrics. And they are able to benchmark themselves against their peers using this kind of ESG metrics. One of our approaches, which is really recognized by the market and our clients, is our double materiality lens that we use. So we're not only looking at the ESG issues that affect the company's enterprise value or financial returns or cost of capital, we're also looking at how it affects the society and environment and how the company really operates, right? Doing good. And lastly, one of the other services that we offer is sustainability ratings. In this case, we are looking at the impact and value creations. So this essentially will help the company to look at the resultant risk and opportunities. The main areas here are the impact analysis to create long-term value and proper behavior, generate value in terms of a sustainable way. Again, also readdressing Tan Sri Azman's, it's a way of living, right? The creation and distribution of value among shareholders and collaborations, but never forgetting the society and the overall value that it brings from social aspects. The society needs to go along with the sustainable journey.
So to add further on your explanation, right? My question to you, is the data challenge more pressing in Asia than it is for European and North American institutions?
Yeah, data challenge is actually a common challenge for all regions. But the key differentiator here is in Europe, in particularly European Union, they already have put in place aggressive legislative roadmap that drive better and more standardized as disclosures. And also in talks and in under development right now is the social taxonomy, one regulation that is going to be very useful as well. So there are also other regulations that are coming up, supply chain due diligence for large companies covering social issues.
Yeah, all right. Thanks, Komi, on that. So I think we don't have much time on this. So I will asking a final question to each of the speaker, whereby you have, I give about 1 or 2 minutes. I give the priority to Tan Sri Azman first to answer this question. Considering all the important issues facing the world, climate, conflict, corruption, where will the S in ESG rank in the important for finance over the coming years? And where should it rank? Tan Sri.
Yeah, I think very briefly, I think of course it ranks very importantly, but I just want to bring back the S in ESG, but also the S in ASEAN to try and link it together, Doctor. Jadi, basically, I think ASEAN, to relate back to that mega trends, let's not forget we are a relatively bright spot in a quite a quickly darkening world. But bersyarat, there are conditions to that. One of it is to make sure that we overcome the issues around E, S, and G, right? The E part is obviously a lot of focus on climate, but sometimes we forget about nature and biodiversity, which actually ASEAN in particular is particularly blessed with. The S, as I mentioned, do no harm first, especially look at labor practices. There's a lot of migrant labor in Malaysia and many countries. I think we need to do better there because the chickens have come home to roost, whether in actual, you can actually measure this in terms of market cap drop, etc. Thirdly, is really the do good part. As I said, workers' rights. I think the role of business, culturally, we are attuned to live and work and create value while protecting and upholding values, as you know. So it's a stakeholder economy. And finally, I think no amount of standards and taxonomies can do the job, or measurement for that matter. They are necessary, but it's not sufficient. What is really sufficient is the bit about the human governance, that we have to be serious. And I think we can. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tan Sri. So, Mr. Shahril, 1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. So my
Yeah.
final point, we're talking about the S in ESG, or even when we talk about sustainability, considering all the important issues in the world. I think that it's ultimately about people, right? And this is taking further what Tan Sri Azman said. It's ultimately about people. It is the overarching component, the intersection of all the elements. And at the end of the day, if we as a nation, if we as a people get the S right in ESG, all the other important issues facing the world today, be it climate, conflict, even to a certain extent, whatever abuses would be addressed. So I think it's about that. It's about that. It's when we talk about addressing all the other issues, it's about us as a humanity, and it's about people.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Shahril. So for me, last word.
Yeah, thank you. Our hope from Moody's perspective and my personal hope is that from financial markets mature, they begin to understand the deep interconnectivity between all the three factors and work towards more systematic approach to tackling both the ESG and other kinds of risks as well. So for example, if ASEAN look at the focus is on energy transition, it's always been, and for that, the challenges from the environmental perspective, but we cannot forget and miss out that the huge social challenges are linked to the transition as well. For example, what happens to the workers that are going to either lose their job or have to be reskilled? So it's overall a deep interconnectivity, and also everybody has got to take a stakeholder approach in this aspect. Thank you.
I think just to summarize, I think in terms of the sustainable finance, provide a better return, right? As well of helping the planet and making society fairer and more inclusive. Evidence is mounting that sustainable business actually offer higher return for investors. I think based on the Global Commission of Economy and Climate, the transition of the low carbon sustainable economy could lead the economic boost of US dollar about 26 trillion by 2030, which is good, which are creating more than 65 million jobs. Sustainable finance has been an area of this particular growth. And with that, I would like to thanks again to our panel, Tan Sri Azman, Mr. Shahril Jimin, and also Komi Rajdev for your sharing knowledge on the topic, the emergence on the S in SG. Thank you very much. I pass and hand over back to you, Shireen. Thank you.